Hey folks, Chris Vandeviver here from WhyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Today I want to share with you an idea that I think you're going to find super strange, but could be a game changer for a few. And that is the idea of using Amp Designer as a channel strip for mixing your tracks. Again, I know this is going to sound super weird, but just bear with me. Real quick, just personally, the way I like to mix is I like plugins that offer very little in terms of knobs and offer next to no visual information in terms of milliseconds related to attack and release or gain reduction meters or spectrum analyzers. It's just, I don't want any of that visual stimulation, because what I find with myself personally is I start to make decisions based on what I'm seeing as opposed to what I'm hearing, right? And at the end of the day, what's the most important thing of all is how things sound in your mixes. So let me just show you real quick an EQ that I'm a huge fan of that doesn't come in Logic, and this is the Plugin Mix Retro EQ. I've had it for years. I love this thing. And if you take a look, clearly there's few options. There's no spectrum analyzer or visual information. This VU meter is really just eye candy. It doesn't really offer much in terms of information. You have a low, mid, or high band. Very few in terms of curves. You have a low or high shelf, a mid parametric band. You can switch the low and high to the same style curve. In the mid band, you can make a little narrower. We just have 3 bands. You can adjust the gain of each band and the frequency of each band, but never both at the same time. So your options for control are limited to one thing at a time. If you turn this knob all the way to the right or left, it pretty much looks the same, so you get no visual information. You really have to use your ears. So I was thinking about this, contemplating what do we have in Logic that offers us the same level of control, the same style of broad EQing and processing. Of course, we have the new vintage EQ collection that came with 10.4, but I wanted something closer to this EQ. So brainstorming and kind of looking around, I stumbled upon Amp Designer. So let's look at Amp Designer here. Of course, the first thought is this is for emulating guitar amps. I plug in my guitar, I pick an amp style, such as a Vox or a Marshall or whatever, and you can mix and match heads and cabs. You can play around with mics and mic placement. But really, at the end of the day, the idea is I'm going to run my guitar or keyboard or something through an amp. Maybe I'm going to make my vocals sound like it's coming out of a radio, or just really mess with the tonal shaping of a track, but not for mixing, right? Not for the utility of mixing and EQing. But if you go to the bottom of the model section here, there's a clean preamp. So you have this preamp section, no cab with no microphone, and then there's an EQ section, reverb, tremolo or vibrato effect, like a pre-gain and post-gain stage. And you have basically low, mid, upper mid, and high. And that's it. And there's various EQs within the EQ section here. You click on the EQ, you have 5 to choose from: British Bright, Vintage, US Classic, Modern, or Boutique. You have a slew of reverbs. And again, like 99.9% of the time, I would never use this thing for my guitar tracks. If I'm plugging in my guitar, I want an amp sound. If I want a clean guitar sound, I wouldn't use this thing. And then you wouldn't think of using Amp Designer for mixing your tracks. But however, this is a perfect opportunity to have that sort of minimalist, restricted workflow. Broad strokes get you to the point that you need to quickly. So I want to demonstrate on a drum loop and vocals the opportunity that we each have in this plugin. All right, so I'm going to bypass it, and we're going to listen to this drum loop within the mix of this client track that I have here.
There's nothing sacred in almost anything.
Okay, it's a sweet drum track. It's just, it sounds kind of phasey. It's not the best sounding thing. So let's use Amp Designer to tonally shape this thing. I'll quickly walk through each of the EQs so you can hear the sound of them. They will be impacted by the knobs here, but I try to set everything to 12 o'clock in hopes that it wouldn't impact it too much. Let's start with the British Bright. Vintage. US Classic. Modern. And Boutique. Now, don't get super dissuaded by how weird these sounds sound. It's kind of like using an analog EQ, where just out of the gate, just plugging your track through it, it sort of tonally shapes it to begin with. But you have opportunity to use these knobs here to take it further. So I'm going to bring it back into the mix, and I'm going to start EQing with this preamp. Okay, so as you saw, I drove the gain up all the way in hopes of kind of dynamically squashing it like a compressor, brought down the master volume to try to level match the best I could. I settled on the US Classic, and then I drove up the presence to kind of bring this drum loop into the world of the rest of the mix and play around with this EQ section until I got a tone I was pretty happy with. And then I brought in a reverb, and I ended up settling on the sweet reverb, just a touch of it to give it a little more room tone. Let's hear this in solo, kind of back and forth. So the one thing I'm desiring out of this drum loop is kind of a little more squash so it sounds more aggressive and in your face. So I'm going to go full guitar amp on this thing. I'm going to bring in pedal board, get rid of this delay, and let's bring in the squash compressor and see what happens here. Bring it back in the mix, play around. So now it sounds more aggressive, but clearly too squashed. I'm going to bring in the splitter here to effectively create a parallel compression situation. All right, and I'm just desiring a little more out of this thing, so I'm going to bring in enveloper. Drive up the sustain and attack to see what I can do. So before and after again. So now there's more aggression, it's brighter, it feels more cohesive with the rest of the track. All right, let's quickly take a look at a vocal track. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna bring in Amp Designer. Let's see what happens.
Almost anything when running circles.
All right, let's bring in the clean preamp.
There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything.
All right, and the last thing I'm desiring is a bit of compression again. So let's use pedal board. Get rid of that. Bring in the squash. See what happens.
There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies.
All right. So real quick, again, I drove up the gain to hopefully compress the dynamics in the vocals. It turned out that I needed a little more compression, so I used the squash compressor here, which is pretty aggressive, but I find with vocals, especially for pop or something modern, you want them really up front. You want them like really in line so you hear every syllable. And then again, I just played with the EQ. I found that the modern EQ was something I was pretty keen on right out of the gate. I drove up the presence, again, to get that air, bring it in line with the track. Drove up the bass a little for a little, that chest-like sound. The mids, so they felt more presence. And the treble, just to, again, get more of that sort of articulation in the vocalist voice. I settled on the bright spring, just a touch to give it a little room feel. Let's hear before and after. So, bypass.
There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies. There's nothing sacred in almost anything when running circles through the tragedies.
And I would say that's not bad right out of the gate with this thing. I'm pretty proud of it. So again, dig into Amp Designer. Use that clean preamp as a channel strip and help you quickly fine tune your tracks. Even if the EQ emulation doesn't sound that awesome immediately, play with the band, see what you can accomplish. Because for me, it's like I'm not getting a lot of visual information. I'm just getting down to EQing and letting my ears tell me what sounds good. So if that was helpful to you, I really hope it was helpful to you. I highly suggest subscribing to this YouTube channel or subscribing on the website, whylogicprorules.com. Every week I post content. My only goal is to provide you with tools, tactics, strategies for getting the most out of Logic. Thanks so much.